In the decades leading up to the Great War of 2077, the world of Fallout existed within a distorted reflection of our own, shaped by a unique divergence in the mid-23rd century that directed human civilization down a path defined by nuclear power, unchecked nationalism, and a global struggle for resources that amplified every political conflict until it reached a catastrophic breaking point. And, to understand the state of the Commonwealth during the events of Fallout 4, it is essential to examine the geopolitical, technological, and social forces that molded pre-war America, turning it into a nation simultaneously obsessed with prosperity and haunted by imminent destruction, a culture where consumer optimism and military paranoia lived side by side, and where the advances that fueled daily conveniences were the same forces that would ultimately trigger the annihilation of the world. By the early 21st century, in this alternate timeline, the United States had become entirely dependent on atomic energy, not just for military supremacy but for everyday life. Cars, appliances, factories, and even children's toys were engineered to run on compact fusion cells, creating a society that treated radiation as casually as electricity, believing that the miracles of atomic science were a boundless, harmless promise rather than a ticking time bomb, while simultaneously the fossil fuel crisis triggered by dwindling global petroleum reserves created fierce competition between nations, with China emerging as the primary geopolitical rival to the United States. For decades, the two superpowers clashed through a series of proxy wars, espionage campaigns, and economic conflicts, as both nations sought to secure dwindling natural resources around the planet, culminating in the Resource Wars, a chaotic period beginning in the 2052, during which the United States struggled to maintain its global influence, ultimately occupying Canada for its oil reserves and constructing massive fortifications against the prospect of full-scale invasion. These events were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of escalating desperation, as nations across the world fought not for ideological differences but for simple survival, with Europe dissolving into fractious nation-states, the Middle East collapsing under the pressure of resource scarcity, and even distant regions like Mexico and Africa destabilizing due to the same pressures, all while the United States transformed into a fortress state that believed its technological superiority, particularly its advancements in power, armor, robotics, laser weaponry, and artificial intelligence, would ensure its dominance in the coming century. Yet the underlying instability of this system became increasingly visible at home, where political corruption, corporate monopolies, and class divides intensified despite the outward appearance of prosperity. Pre-war Boston, the region that would become known as the Commonwealth, exemplified this tension perfectly. A city with world-class academic institutions like the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, advanced robotics research programs, prosperous biotechnology firms, and thriving suburban communities, but also a region fraught with government experiments, corporate abuses, and a growing fear of foreign infiltration. Vault-Tec, the corporation tasked with constructing massive underground vaults to protect the population, used the region as a major testing ground for its experiments in social engineering, human endurance, and genetic manipulation. Behind its patriotic marketing campaigns, Vault-Tec received lucrative government contracts based on its willingness to turn the vaults into laboratories designed to explore the limits of human psychology under controlled conditions of stress, deprivation, or manipulation. In the suburbs of Boston, including the community of Sanctuary Hills, the American dream flourished on the surface: clean streets, manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the assurance that the United States, despite rising tensions, remained the greatest and safest nation in human history, all supported by an army of domestic robots, convenience devices, and atomic appliances that promised a life of effortless comfort. Yet beneath this glossy veneer lay a society living in denial of the cracks forming around it. Citizens routinely practiced nuclear evacuation drills. Propaganda saturated every billboard and television broadcast, and government surveillance expanded dramatically as fears of Chinese espionage intensified, particularly after the Anchorage Front and the U.S. China conflict became a prolonged, grueling engagement that consumed increasing levels of manpower and resources. These anxieties were not limited to Boston, however, as cities across the country embraced the culture of patriotic conformity promoted by the federal government and enforced through institutions like the Office of Strategic Intelligence, which used both propaganda and covert operations to maintain social cohesion. Everywhere the message was the same: the United States was strong, the nation was unified, and technological progress guaranteed victory. But for many Americans, including the residents of the Commonwealth, an unspoken dread lingered beneath this message, reflected most clearly in the public's obsession with Vault-X vaults, not simply as optional shelters, but as essential lifelines that many families hoped would spare them from a nuclear apocalypse they increasingly believed was inevitable. Vault-Tech actively exploited these fears, urging citizens to secure their spots in vaults while simultaneously framing the vaults as symbols of national resilience. And in the months leading up to 2077, families like the one living in Sanctuary Hills, Nate, a decorated U.S. Army veteran of the Anchorage campaign, and Nora, an accomplished lawyer, were convinced by salesmen that their purchases of Vault-Tech spots were justified insurance policies for a troubled world, even as they tried to maintain normal lives for themselves and their infant son, Shaun. Meanwhile, deep within Boston's research community, a more dramatic transformation was underway: the rise of the Institute, the shadowy successor to CIT. Formed by scientists who fled underground during the chaos of the resource wars, the Institute first focused on rebuilding civilization through self-sufficient technology, including advanced robotics and agricultural innovations, but soon developed a new ambition: to create perfect synthetic humans capable of understanding, mimicking, and eventually surpassing their creators. Although the Institute's influence was still largely unknown to the general public prior to the war, its secret research represented one of the most significant technological shifts in American history, a painstaking attempt to engineer a future in which humanity could survive its own mistakes through artificial life. The Institute's breakthroughs with Generation 1 and Generation 2 synths may have been anonymous to surface dwellers, but its eventual creation of Generation 3 synths, biological, almost indistinguishable from humans, marked a turning point that would shape the Commonwealth for centuries to come. Even without knowing the specifics, many pre-war citizens sensed that powerful forces were reshaping the world around them. The militarization of civilian life, the expansion of private military contractors like the Gunners, the aggressive recruitment strategies of the U.S. military, and the drastic growth of programs like the Minutemen in regional defense all demonstrated that America was preparing for a monumental conflict, even as politicians publicly reassured citizens that peace was attainable. By the fall of 2077, however, the illusion of stability had grown increasingly fragile. Food shortages, energy rationing, rolling blackouts, and mass protests erupted across the nation. Reports of Chinese infiltrators, saboteurs, and spies filled the news, even when evidence was often exaggerated or fabricated. Patriotism became both a genuine conviction and a tool manipulated by corporations and the government to maintain order, and the line between security and oppression blurred in ways that few Americans dared to question. Thus, when the first nuclear detonations hit on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, the world was not caught completely unaware, only unprepared for how quickly everything would fall apart. Cities vanished in seconds, communication networks collapsed instantly, and the global chain reaction of nuclear strikes marked the final culmination of decades of political tension, technological arrogance, and human fear. In Sanctuary Hills, families scrambled toward Vault 111 as alarms blared across the Commonwealth, and Nate and Nora, clutching their infant son, barely reached the Vault platform as the shockwave from the detonation over Boston consumed the world they had known. Above ground, society melted into radioactive ruin. Below ground, Vault-Tech's experiments began, sealing survivors into isolation, cryogenic chambers, and laboratories designed not to preserve civilization, but to test it under unimaginable conditions. The Great War lasted only 2 hours, but it brought an end to centuries of global conflict and ushered in the beginning of a new era, one defined not by nations, governments, or armies, but by survivors navigating the shattered remains of a world built on misplaced faith in technology and the belief that the future could be engineered through power alone. When the bombs fell on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, the world entered its final, irreversible transformation, and the Commonwealth, like every other region of the United States, was instantly thrust into an apocalypse that no amount of propaganda, military buildup, or technological optimism could prevent, beginning with a moment that lasted only seconds, yet defined the fate of millions. The flash of a nuclear detonation blooming like an artificial sun over Boston's skyline. For the sole survivor, who had only moments earlier been preparing for an ordinary day in the peaceful suburb of Sanctuary Hills, the attack marked the violent collapse of the fragile illusion of stability that pre-war America had desperately clung to. The early hours had hinted at nothing unusual, aside from the constant undercurrent of global tension broadcast on every television station and echoed in every newspaper headline, but even those anxieties seemed distant compared to the calm domestic life inside Sanctuary Hills, where the sole survivor lived with a spouse and their infant son, Shaun, in an idyllic neighborhood built atop the promise that the United States, despite global chaos, remained the greatest and safest nation on the planet. That illusion shattered the moment Vault-Tech's blindingly cheerful salesman's promises became real, when the civil defense sirens began to wail and radio broadcasts confirmed that nuclear strikes had begun on the West Coast, spreading panic faster than any evacuation plan could possibly keep up with. Sanctuary Hills erupted into chaos as families sprinted toward Vault 111, the only structure in the region designed to withstand a direct nuclear blast, and the sole survivor, clutching their infant child, raced through the neighborhood alongside terrified neighbors, while the sky above Boston lit with unnatural intensity. The Vault-Tech platform activated just in time for the sole survivor's family and a handful of others, descending underground as a colossal shockwave thundered across the hills, tearing apart trees, homes, and anything left unshielded by the Vault's steel walls. Although Vault-Tech had marketed Vault 111 as a shelter designed to preserve American lives in the event of nuclear war, the truth, unknown to all residents, was that Vault 111 was never intended to protect its occupants in the way they imagined. Instead, it was constructed to serve as a long-term cryogenic experiment, testing the psychological and physiological effects of sustained suspended animation on unknowing participants. The sole survivor and their family were ushered deeper into the facility, under the guise of a decontamination procedure, unaware that the vault staff had strict orders to initiate cryogenic preservation as soon as the residents entered the chamber. Within minutes, the cryopods sealed shut, locking the occupants in a silent, frozen imprisonment from which they would not awaken for more than a century. Above ground, the Commonwealth was rapidly transforming from a thriving New England hub into a wasteland of fire, ash, and radioactive storms. Boston, once a center of academia, commerce, and technological innovation, was gutted by nuclear blasts that annihilated entire districts instantly, while leaving others to crumble under sustained radiation and structural collapse. Iconic landmarks such as the Massachusetts State House, Copley Square, and the CIT campus were either obliterated or warped beyond recognition. The city's infrastructure disintegrated almost immediately, with transit systems becoming twisted metal, skyscrapers toppling into the streets, and bridges, once symbols of connectivity, collapsing under intense seismic shockwaves. Those who survived the initial detonations faced the horrifying reality of the nuclear winter that followed. Rolling clouds of irradiated dust that turned the skies black, storms that tore across the Commonwealth with hurricane force, and radioactive fallout that contaminated water, soil, and lungs indiscriminately. In the days following the Great War, the Commonwealth became an ungoverned battlefield of desperation. The federal government, already weakened by decades of conflict and resource depletion, ceased to function within hours of the attack. Military outposts were abandoned or overwhelmed, communication networks collapsed, and the chain of command disintegrated, as commanders, soldiers, and civilians scattered in a futile attempt to find safe zones that no longer existed. National Guard units attempted to establish quarantine zones around Boston, but the sheer volume of radiation made any long-term containment impossible. Many attempted evacuations failed as convoys were ambushed by panicked mobs or caught in storms of radioactive debris. Across the region, shelters overcrowded with survivors began to fail due to lack of food, water, or functioning equipment, leading to mass deaths within days. While the surface descended into chaos, the sole survivor and the other vault, 111 occupants, remained suspended in cryogenic stasis, completely unaware of the devastation unfolding above. It was only after an unspecified period, likely years, that the sole survivor's cryopod briefly opened during a critical moment engineered not by the vault's technical schedule, but by the actions of an intruding group affiliated with the Institute. In a dimly lit chamber illuminated by flickering emergency lights, the sole survivor regained partial consciousness in time to witness an armed team, led by the mercenary Kellogg, enter the cryogenic chamber. With clinical efficiency, Kellogg's team forcibly opened the cryopod containing the sole survivor's spouse and infant son, Shaun. Despite the sole survivor's attempts to break free, still immobilized by cryogenic debilitation, they could do nothing but watch helplessly as Kellogg executed their spouse and abducted Shaun, an act driven not by cruelty but by orders from the Institute, which sought the child for reasons that would not become clear for decades. The pod resealed, plunging the sole survivor back into unconsciousness as Vault 111 returned to its automated cycles, its systems slowly degrading from decades of neglect. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth evolved into a radically different ecosystem, shaped by mutation, anarchy, and the resilience of those who refused to die. Radiation fundamentally altered the region's flora and fauna, creating species such as radstags, yaoguai, bloatflies, and miralurks, mutated descendants of pre-war animals adapted to their harsh new environment. Some organisms developed hardened exoskeletons, increased aggression, or bioluminescence, while others exhibited grotesque deformities brought about by continuous exposure to nuclear fallout. Humans were no exception. While some managed to survive with minimal mutation, others became feral ghouls, their bodies decaying yet functionally immortal, driven mad by neurological degeneration. These ghouls became haunting reminders of the war, wandering ruins of their former lives, sometimes retaining memories and identities but often losing all sense of humanity. Within decades, new human communities emerged, built from the ruins of pre-war neighborhoods, industrial sites, and military installations. Diamond City, formed within the preserved structure of Fenway Park, became one of the largest and most stable settlements, using the ballpark's concrete walls as natural protection against raiders, mutants, and storms. Goodneighbor emerged as a haven for misfits, ghouls, criminals, and those seeking refuge outside Diamond City's stricter governance. The raider groups that roamed the Commonwealth developed their own cultures and power structures, often brutal and anarchic, driven by scarcity, addiction, and the collapse of all pre-war morality. Over time, factions such as the Gunners evolved into paramilitary forces, operating with ruthless professionalism, selling their services to the highest bidder, and controlling strategic locations throughout the region. Meanwhile, remnants of pre-war organizations, such as the Brotherhood of Steel, began to rebuild their power, though their presence in the Commonwealth would not fully manifest until much later, when the Prydwen arrived under the command of Elder Arthur Maxon. Throughout all of this, the Institute continued its secretive work deep beneath the ruins of Boston. Protected from the devastation above, it developed increasingly advanced technologies, perfecting synthetic humans and intervening subtly in Commonwealth affairs, while most surface dwellers dismissed its existence as myth. Its incursions left behind trails of fear and distrust, as missing persons were often blamed on Institute kidnappings, and sightings of mysterious, emotionless androids fueled local paranoia. Though the Institute remained hidden, its influence shaped the region even before the sole survivor regained consciousness. It would take more than 200 years from the moment the bombs fell before Vault 111's malfunctioning systems finally reopened the sole survivor's cryopod. Life support in the vault had deteriorated to catastrophic levels, causing failures across multiple cryogenic units and triggering emergency unlock protocols. When the sole survivor awoke, the once sterile vault had become a tomb filled with dead technicians and fellow residents. Their cryopods failed or sabotaged, leaving their bodies frozen in place, a grim reminder of Vault-Tech's indifference to human life. Stumbling through silent corridors coated in frost and darkness, the sole survivor emerged into a world they could not have imagined. One where the familiar landscape of Sanctuary Hills had been replaced by skeletal ruins, twisted metal, and creeping vegetation reclaiming the remains of human civilization. Radiation hung in the air, feral ghouls lurked in the outskirts, and the Commonwealth, once full of life and progress, now lay in a state of perpetual decay. The Great War had lasted only hours, but its consequences would echo for centuries, shaping the Commonwealth into a fractured, perilous expanse, where humanity struggled to adapt, rebuild, and redefine its identity. And as the sole survivor stepped into the blinding light of the post-apocalyptic dawn, they carried with them not only the trauma of personal loss, but the burden of navigating a world that had been reshaped entirely by the catastrophic morning when civilization died. Vault 111 was never the sanctuary its marketing promised, and from the moment the sole survivor and the other residents descended beneath Sanctuary Hills, their fate had already been predetermined by Vault-Tech's cold, scientific ambition, an ambition grounded not in the preservation of human life, but in the company's relentless pursuit of experimental data gathered through unregulated, unethical trials that treated American citizens not as people, but as variables in controlled environments designed to test psychological endurance, long-term isolation, and human viability under suspended animation. The very design of Vault 111 reflected this duplicitous purpose. While its bright, patriotic posters and immaculate stainless steel corridors gave the impression of a technological haven built to shield families from nuclear devastation, its true function manifested in the cryogenic chamber buried at the heart of the facility, where dozens of cryopods stood, ready to freeze their occupants indefinitely under the guise of decontamination. But, for the sole survivor and their family, who entered the vault under the insane pressure of the explosions tearing the world apart above them, there was no reason to suspect that their lives had already been surrendered to a decades-long experimental protocol, from which only one of them would ever emerge alive. The moments following their entry were steeped in deception. The vault staff, adhering to rehearsed protocols, ushered the residents through shining corridors lined with motivational posters that encouraged civic duty and optimism, all the while knowing that they were delivering these families into what amounted to human test chambers. The sole survivor, spouse, and infant son were directed into a cryogenic pod under the pretense of brief decontamination, a term deliberately chosen to sound routine and harmless. As the pod sealed shut and began its chilling cycle, the sole survivor experienced the last sensations of pre-war life, the hum of machinery, and the deepening cold that gradually transitioned into total unconsciousness. Around them, the entire vault population was silently frozen in place, their expressions locked in fear, confusion, or resignation as the war raged above. Once sealed, Vault 111 shifted to automated protocols. Its staff, who remained active only for a short period, were instructed to monitor resident vitals and maintain the cryogenic systems, but not to revive or interact with the frozen occupants under any circumstances, unless directed by Vault-Tec headquarters, orders that would never come, as the world outside rapidly succumbed to nuclear fire. As months turned into years and the Vault staff dwindled due to resource shortages and mounting despair, the human element of oversight deteriorated. Some staff succumbed to radiation sickness from early breaches in the Vault's filtration systems. Others died attempting to escape the facility, believing that surface conditions had stabilized enough for survival, and several took their own lives as the reality of their imprisonment sank in. Records left behind in hastily written terminal entries described the staff's growing dread. The realization that Vault-Tec had no intention of ever reawakening the residents, that their work was meaningless beyond maintaining an experiment that had already taken too many lives, and that the outside world had truly been erased. One entry from the Vault's chief scientist reveals an internal conflict between respecting the sanctity of life and fulfilling the experimental mandate, though ultimately, the scientist chose obedience, locking cryogenic test protocols in place and sealing off areas of the Vault as systems degraded. Eventually, the last surviving staff members perished, leaving Vault 111 fully automated and the frozen residents suspended in an endless cycle of artificial sleep. It was during this period of total abandonment that the Institute first discovered Vault 111. Operating deep beneath the ruins of Boston, the Institute maintained an extensive surveillance network and routinely sent reconnaissance teams to pre-war structures in search of viable genetic material, advanced technology, or unexplored resources. At some point in the decades following the Great War, Institute operatives detected the Vault's presence and eventually traced its systems to functional life support mechanisms still operating despite centuries of neglect. One such team, led by the mercenary Kellogg, infiltrated the vault using stolen access codes and bypassed security systems that had become brittle with age. Their mission was precise: retrieve the child, Shaun, whose genetic purity made him uniquely valuable to the Institute's long-term research into synth biology. At the time of the break-in, Shaun was still an infant, while the sole survivor remained frozen in stasis. Kellogg's team opened the pod containing Shaun and the sole survivor's spouse, forcibly extracting the child while the spouse resisted. To ensure compliance and prevent future interference, Kellogg executed the spouse in front of the sole survivor, who, despite being conscious enough to witness the event, was still physically impaired. This moment of helplessness became the emotional anchor for the sole survivor's future journey. After the kidnapping, the Institute resealed the cryopod and exited the vault, leaving the sole survivor to endure several more decades of cryogenic suspension as the vault continued its gradual descent into mechanical decay. Over time, structural failures accumulated, cryogenic seals weakened, temperature controls became unstable, and the automated systems tasked with maintaining life support began to malfunction at an increasing rate. One by one, the other pods in the chamber failed catastrophically. Without staff to repair them, residents died silently as temperature fluctuations disrupted their delicate biological states. Freezing units ruptured, power relays burned out, and in some cases, pods thawed prematurely, killing their occupants during the return to consciousness. Terminal logs later recovered by the sole survivor would confirm that the vault experienced multiple life support meltdowns that the deteriorating AI systems could no longer manage. Despite these failures, the sole survivor's pod miraculously remained functional, likely due to a combination of luck, pod placement, and the fact that the Institute had recently opened and resealed it, inadvertently resetting certain systems that prolonged its operational lifespan. Eventually, more than 2 centuries after the Great War, Vault 111 reached a critical threshold of technological failure. Life support throughout the facility faltered. Internal power grids began choking on degraded generators and corroded wiring. Cryogenic systems entered cascading failure. And the Vault's emergency protocols triggered a last resort safety measure: forced manual release of surviving pods. The sole survivor's pod unlocked with a violent hiss of escaping gas and flickering lights, releasing them from suspended animation and thrusting them into a world radically changed from the one they had known. As they stumbled out of the pod, their body racked with weakness and disorientation, they were greeted by silent rows of other pods, each containing the frozen corpses of neighbors and friends who never awakened. The vault itself had become a tomb, a sterile mausoleum sealed off from the devastation above. And yet the sole survivor was the only living member of the experiment. Still recovering from decades of cryogenic atrophy, the sole survivor navigated the vault's corridors in search of answers. Along the way, they encountered remnants of the vault staff. Skeletal remains collapsed over terminals and workstations, accompanied by log entries documenting the facility's final years. These digital records revealed the despair of the staff as they realized that Vault-Tec had abandoned them, the slow unraveling of their morale as supplies dwindled, and their fear of the cryogenic experiment's implications. The sole survivor learned that Vault 111 was never intended to preserve its residents for repopulation or recovery, but rather to test human behavior in suspended animation. No reawakening protocols were programmed beyond the emergency systems triggered by catastrophic failure, and no external instructions had ever been transmitted. Everything the residents had been told was a lie. Their memories of sanctuary, safety, and protection had been fabricated by a corporation that viewed them as expendable assets. When the sole survivor finally reached the exit, they engaged the vault's massive door mechanism, an engineering marvel of rotating steel plates, hydraulic pistons, and atmospheric seals that opened with a groaning, mechanical roar. Light from the outside world poured through the widening gap, revealing the scorched landscape of the Commonwealth for the first time in more than 200 years. As the sole survivor ascended toward the surface, they bore not only the shock of awakening into an unrecognizable world, but also the deeper, personal torment of witnessing the murder of their spouse and the abduction of their infant child by unknown forces. Their emergence marked the end of Vault 111's cryogenic experiment and the beginning of an odyssey through a world transformed by death, mutation, and the collapse of civilization. The sole survivor alone carried the trauma of that frozen past, stepping into the wasteland with the weight of history pressing down upon them and a singular purpose taking root in their mind: to discover what had become of Shaun, to uncover the truth behind the Institute's intrusion, and to make sense of a world shaped by centuries of destruction and survival that had unfolded entirely while they lay trapped in a steel coffin of ice. When the sole survivor finally awakened from the failing cryogenic system deep within Vault 111, he entered a world where 2 centuries of silent decay had transformed every familiar surface into a corroded relic of a civilization erased in minutes. And stumbling through the dimly lit corridors with only fragmented memories of Nora's murder and Shaun's abduction to guide him, he found that the once sterile vault had become a tomb filled with the remnants of long-dead staff, malfunctioning equipment, and oversized radroaches that had evolved in the irradiated dark, forcing him to adapt instantly to a new rule of survival defined by resourcefulness and vigilance. Retrieving his first weapons, supplies, and the Pip-Boy still attached to his cryopod, the sole survivor approached the vault's massive exit mechanism, a final barrier that sealed him away from the truth of what lay above, and activated the sequence that would alter his destiny, triggering centuries-old machinery to thunder back to life and lift the colossal door, releasing a wave of cold, blinding sunlight into the depth of Vault 111. Ascending to the surface through the metal platform and stepping out into the open air, he confronted the desolation of the Commonwealth for the first time. Finding Sanctuary Hills reduced to a skeletal husk of warped foundations, collapsed roofs, and rusted appliances, all overshadowed by a silence so complete it felt hostile. Yet amid the ruin he encountered Mr. Handy, still functioning after 210 years, whose glitching optimism and long loneliness provided the sole survivor with the first confirmation that he truly stood in the far future. Armed with scraps of information about the outside world, he navigated the surrounding woodlands where mutated insects, irradiated plants, and shifting weather patterns demonstrated that the Commonwealth was not merely destroyed but radically altered, and as he scavenged for supplies, pieced together fragments of the past, and caught the first distant signs of human settlement beyond the ruined neighborhood, the sole survivor made the implicit decision that would define everything to come. He would adapt, endure, and rebuild, fueled by equal parts grief, determination, and the faint but unbroken hope that Shaun, somewhere in this shattered landscape, might still be alive. Stepping beyond the ruins of Sanctuary Hills, the sole survivor entered the wider Commonwealth, a region that had not simply collapsed after the Great War but had fractured into a mosaic of clashing cultures, hostile factions, and irradiated wastelands shaped by 2 centuries of chaos. And as he made his earliest journeys through the broken streets, forests, and industrial shells of post-war Boston, he came to understand that the Commonwealth's greatest threat was not merely radiation or scarcity, but the collapse of a unified social order, replaced instead by localized power structures that rose and fell like tides. Raider gangs controlled large swaths of territory with unpredictable violence, operating from fortified strongholds such as the Corvega assembly plant, the combat zone, and the decaying highways that had become perches for snipers and scavenger kings, while deeper within the city, packs of feral ghouls wandered through abandoned neighborhoods like wild animals trapped in the shapes of forgotten citizens, their numbers growing in areas where radiation pooled in lethal concentrations. Further still, the sole survivor encountered super mutants, green-skinned giants produced from forced evolutionary virus contamination, who had established entrenched sub-communities in places like Trinity Tower and the Fens, each individual driven by a mixture of aggression, confusion, and the deteriorating cognitive function inherent to their strain, turning them into both territorial threats and tragic markers of pre-war scientific hubris. Yet amid the dangers, fragile pockets of human civilization persisted in forms such as Diamond City, a bustling marketplace built within the remains of Fenway Park, where traders, mercenaries, farmers, and families struggled to maintain a semblance of normal life under the watchful eye of Mayor McDonough, whose public reassurance masked private paranoia about synth infiltration. Smaller settlements, from Ten Pines Bluff in the north to Somerville Place in the south, fought daily battles against starvation, raiders, and wildlife, and many relied on little more than stubbornness and scrap-built defenses to keep the night at bay. Environmental challenges reinforced the region's instability, from sudden radstorms that swept across the skies in sickly green clouds of ionized particles, to mutated wildlife such as yaoguai, molar rats, radstags, bloodbugs, and the ever-present threat of deathclaws. Apex predators evolved from pre-war Jackson's chameleons, whose speed and intelligence made them nightmare encounters for any traveler. Through all this, the sole survivor gradually understood that the Commonwealth was not a wasteland waiting for rescue, but a battlefield of competing visions for the future, shaped by communities barely holding together and factions poised for eventual war. And as he moved between settlements, assisted strangers, and documented the land's dangers, he unknowingly began his transformation from a displaced relic of the old world into a key figure in the struggle to determine what the post-war world would become. The Minutemen, once a celebrated militia formed during the early stages of the post-war Commonwealth to provide localized defense against raiders and mutant threats, had been reduced to near extinction by the fall of Quincy, an event that epitomized the vulnerability of idealistic organizations in a lawless land. And when the sole survivor first encountered Preston Garvey and the handful of remaining Minutemen in Concord, he saw that their once broad influence had collapsed under the weight of relentless attacks, dwindling manpower, and the encroachment of larger, more organized factions, such as the Brotherhood of Steel and the Institute's covert agents. Despite their diminished state, the Minutemen retained a moral authority rooted in the notion that any person in the Commonwealth deserved protection, that settlements should not have to succumb to raider oppression, and that collective effort, rather than domination, could rebuild society. And it was within this context that the sole survivor began his restoration of the faction, traveling from settlement to settlement, recruiting citizens, fortifying communities, and gradually transforming the Minutemen from a fragmented relic into a functional, disciplined force capable of shaping the future of the Commonwealth. As the sole survivor rebuilt the Minutemen, he confronted the paradox inherent in their philosophy. While they were committed to voluntary cooperation, They had no means to project power effectively without the intervention of the sole survivor, whose unique combination of pre-war experience, survival skills, and leadership became the linchpin of their revival. And through these actions, the Minutemen evolved from an idealistic concept into a tangible military and social presence, offering protection to Diamond City, Sanctuary Hills, and dozens of smaller settlements, creating supply lines, establishing lookout posts, and coordinating rapid response teams, all while maintaining the faction's original ethos of democratic accountability and communal responsibility. Throughout the process, the sole survivor also witnessed the complexities of governance in a fractured society, negotiating disputes among settlers, brokering truces with minor raider groups, and balancing the often conflicting needs of survival, morality, and the greater good, which ultimately positioned the Minutemen as both a stabilizing force and a symbol of hope for ordinary citizens, while simultaneously revealing the faction's limitations in confronting larger, better armed powers, foreshadowing the inevitable clashes to come with the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, and other dominant forces whose ambitions threatened to overshadow the grassroots ideals that the sole survivor sought to preserve. The Brotherhood of Steel, a quasi-religious, techno-militaristic organization originating from the remnants of the U.S. military and surviving pre-war research divisions, had long maintained a philosophy centered on the recovery, preservation, and control of advanced technology, and by the time the sole survivor emerged into the post-war Commonwealth, the Brotherhood, under the leadership of Elder Arthur Maxson, was executing a deliberate eastern expansion that would bring its power into direct confrontation with other factions and shape the political landscape of Boston for decades to come. Arriving with the Prydwen, an airship of overwhelming firepower and logistical capability, the Brotherhood established fortified positions throughout the region, projecting a military presence that both reassured and intimidated, and in doing so they sought to consolidate control over critical pre-war technological sites, asserting dominion over areas like Cambridge, the Mass Fusion Building, and the remnants of the old Institute network, while simultaneously enforcing strict discipline over their own ranks, integrating local recruits, and attempting to indoctrinate members with their rigid code that equated human technological stewardship with moral duty. The organization's rapid territorial consolidation underscored its dual nature as both protector and authoritarian force, as the sole survivor observed their interactions with smaller settlements, noting the tension between those who welcomed the security and those who feared the Brotherhood's willingness to deploy lethal force to maintain order, militarily. The Prydwen's arrival introduced overwhelming tactical superiority, with vertibird patrols, heavily armed infantry, and cutting-edge energy weapons creating an environment in which resistance was often futile, yet the Brotherhood's ideological rigidity, prioritizing technology over humanity and viewing synthetic lifeforms as existential threats, set the stage for inevitable conflict with the Institute, the Railroad, and even remnants of the Minutemen whose egalitarian ideals clashed with the Brotherhood's hierarchical command structure. Throughout their campaign, Elder Maxson's leadership emphasized not only expansion but also doctrinal purity, insisting that his soldiers eradicate any perceived technological misuse, while simultaneously positioning the Brotherhood as the Commonwealth's legitimate authority on science, innovation, and security. And the sole survivor, moving among the faction's operations, witnessed the calculated blend of charisma, discipline, and martial strategy that allowed the Brotherhood to dominate the region, while understanding that their presence represented both a stabilizing force for settlements threatened by raiders and mutants, and a looming shadow that complicated the already fragile balance of power between the fractured human and mutant populations of post-war Boston. Beneath the ruins of Boston, the Institute operated in secret as the ultimate remnant of pre-war scientific ambition, a subterranean citadel of technology, refinement, and control, hidden from the eyes of the Commonwealth's surface dwellers, and by the time the sole survivor began traversing the wasteland above, the Institute had already perfected its network of synths, human-like androids designed to infiltrate, manipulate, and replace humans with unparalleled subtlety, an achievement representing decades of research that began with the Commonwealth Institute of Technology and continued uninterrupted in isolation during the war and the following centuries. The organization was governed by a strict hierarchy of scientists and administrators, with Father, once the sole survivor's infant son, Shaun, at its apex, a living embodiment of the Institute's ideology that human progress could be preserved and directed through controlled evolution and technological mastery. And this parentage linked the sole survivor's personal tragedy directly to the core of the Institute's power, creating a conflict of ethics, familial loyalty, and survival that would define the remainder of his journey. The Institute's operations included the deployment of synths into civilian communities, espionage, targeted abductions, and clandestine interventions in settlement disputes, all executed with clinical efficiency and virtually no public acknowledgement, as citizens often mistook disappearances and unexplained events for raider attacks or mutant predation. Never realizing that the hands manipulating events were cold, human-shaped machines programmed to achieve a vision of the future that only the Institute's leaders could comprehend. Technological achievements extended beyond synthetic life, encompassing energy weapons, advanced robotics, cryogenics, and biological research, with the Institute maintaining isolated research pods, laboratories, and agricultural systems deep beneath the ruins, capable of sustaining itself entirely independently from the devastated surface above. And yet, despite their control over material resources and advanced technology, the Institute faced intrinsic limitations. Its isolation produced a society disconnected from the immediate human reality of the Commonwealth, making its decisions appear arbitrary or cruel to those outside, while internal dissent among scientists over ethics, morality, and the treatment of both synths and kidnapped humans occasionally surfaced in subtle acts of sabotage, internal politics, and debates over the direction of synthetic development. The sole survivor, gradually uncovering the Institute's operations through intelligence gathered in settlements, intercepted transmissions, and recovered terminals, recognized that this shadowy organization represented both the pinnacle of human ingenuity and a profound moral quandary. A group whose scientific prowess could rebuild civilization in the image of its designers, yet whose methods undermined fundamental human freedoms. And it was within this context that he prepared to confront Father, understand Shaun's role, and navigate a hidden war being waged beneath the very streets he had once known. A war whose stakes were nothing less than the soul of the Commonwealth itself. In the fractured and dangerous landscape of the post-war Commonwealth, the railroad emerged as a clandestine network devoted to the protection, liberation, and relocation of synths who had gained self-awareness. Operating from the Old North Church in Boston as their principal headquarters, and while the sole survivor moved across the surface, he gradually learned that this secretive faction represented a morally complex counterpoint to both the Institute and the Brotherhood of Steel, advocating for freedom and autonomy for artificial life, while risking violent retribution from organizations that viewed synths as tools, property, or threats. The railroad's foundation rested on a philosophy that synths, once sentient, deserved the same rights, dignity, and protection as humans, and in practice, This meant orchestrating rescue missions, providing false identities, and establishing safe havens where liberated synths could integrate into society, often under the constant threat of discovery by Institute agents who tracked and retrieved their creations, a process that relied on careful intelligence, stealth, and the willingness to use lethal force if necessary. Within the Old North Church, a network of operatives, safe houses, and communication lines enabled the railroad to operate efficiently despite being numerically and materially inferior to the Institute, and the sole survivor observed firsthand how faction leaders such as Desdemona and Deacon balanced secrecy with direct action, issuing orders for extraction missions, negotiating with sympathetic citizens, and coordinating surveillance on both Institute synths and rogue elements among the Commonwealth's surface populations. Ethically, the railroad's existence challenged the sole survivor to confront the moral ambiguity of synthetic life, questioning whether technological creation justified the control exercised by the Institute, and whether violence in defense of freedom could be reconciled with the survival of ordinary human communities threatened by raids, mutant attacks, and environmental hazards. As he engaged with the railroad, the sole survivor witnessed the practical outcomes of their efforts, from the extraction of synths from Diamond City and other settlements, to the management of safe travel corridors that avoided detection by hostile forces. And he understood that this struggle was not only about physical survival, but also about the broader question of agency, identity, and justice, in a world where the distinction between human and artificial life had become blurred. Ultimately, the railroad's operations provided the sole survivor with both allies and moral direction, influencing his strategies as he confronted the Institute, navigated alliances with other factions, and pursued his ultimate goal of finding Shaun, a pursuit that would inevitably bring him into direct conflict with the very organization responsible for the child's abduction and the systemic subjugation of an entire class of sentient beings. The hunt for Shaun, the sole survivor's abducted son, became the defining pursuit of his post-Vault journey, centered around the elusive mercenary Conrad Kellogg, whose history was entwined with the Institute's clandestine operations and whose life was shaped by mercenary contracts, military discipline, and an unyielding loyalty to the organization that had commissioned him to kidnap the child. And as the sole survivor traced Kellogg's movements from the ruins of Sanctuary Hills to the streets and industrial zones of Diamond City, he uncovered a trail of violence, subterfuge, and technological manipulation, each discovery revealing the depth of Kellogg's professionalism and the Institute's reach. Diamond City, the heart of the Commonwealth's fragile civilian infrastructure, provided the first tangible clues, as rumors, terminal logs, and eyewitness accounts pointed to Kellogg's presence in its alleys, bars, and warehouses, where he had exerted influence over local factions, coerced informants, and eliminated obstacles with lethal precision, demonstrating a chilling understanding of both human behavior and the moral compromises demanded by his employer. The sole survivor's pursuit extended to Fort Hagen, a pre-war military installation converted into a fortified stronghold, where Kellogg had leveraged the site's defensive advantages, laying traps and utilizing automated turrets, security cameras, and pre-war weaponry to control the environment, reflecting not only his tactical skill, but also the Institute's foresight in preparing operatives to operate independently across hostile terrain. As the sole survivor navigated the urban ruins, scavenged supplies, and avoided or confronted both raider and mutant threats, he began piecing together the complex network of surveillance, subterfuge, and preemptive measures that had allowed Kellogg to remain one step ahead, and he realized that retrieving Shaun would require both strategic planning and moral fortitude. as Kellogg's methods, abduction, execution, and intimidation, were designed to test anyone who sought to intervene. The culmination of this pursuit was an inevitable confrontation, wherein the sole survivor, armed with both pre-war weapons and the practical experience gained from surviving the Commonwealth's myriad dangers, faced Kellogg in Fort Hagen's Central Command, a battle that combined tactical ingenuity, improvisation, and the personal stakes of a father seeking to reclaim his son. And through this confrontation, the sole survivor not only gained access to critical information about Shaun's fate, but also learned about the Institute's broader ambitions, the extent of its control over synthetic life, and the ethical dilemmas that would shape his subsequent decisions in rebuilding, confronting, and ultimately determining the future of the Commonwealth. Following the violent confrontation with Conrad Kellogg, the sole survivor's pursuit of answers led him to the Memory Den, a shadowy, neon-lit establishment in Good Neighbor where the secrets of minds could be bought, extracted, and relived. And here he encountered a labyrinth of memory, identity, and ethical uncertainty that would challenge both his resolve and his understanding of his son's fate. For the den's proprietor, Dr. Amari, offered access to Kellogg's consciousness through a process that allowed the sole survivor to witness the past, as if living it firsthand, a technique that blurred the line between observer and participant, while revealing the intimate, disturbing details of Kellogg's actions, motivations, and loyalties. Stepping into the booth, the sole survivor entered a curated reconstruction of Kellogg's mind, populated by his memories, fears, and personal reflections, and immediately experienced a disorienting fusion of time, perspective, and emotion, as he witnessed the events surrounding Shaun's abduction not as reports or evidence, but as living, breathing moments replayed with all their intensity and consequence. From the careful execution of the Institute's orders to the cold efficiency with which Kellogg had eliminated his target, and from the perspectives of the sole survivor himself, now forced to process the trauma of his family's murder, alongside the stark realization that the child's life had been carefully controlled from the shadows by an organization more powerful, patient, and technologically advanced than any post-war survivor could have anticipated. Through these memory sequences, the sole survivor pieced together the unsettling timeline of Shaun's life, noting that the child's rapid maturation within the Institute, hidden deep beneath the surface, was facilitated by advanced technology, synthetic caretakers, and rigorous indoctrination, all orchestrated to mold him into the figure known later as Father, the enigmatic leader of the Institute, whose vision for humanity was simultaneously paternal and authoritarian. And as the sole survivor relived these events, he was forced to confront the ethical paradox of intervention, understanding that his son had been both victim and instrument, groomed for a purpose that could conflict violently with the sole survivor's moral compass, while also recognizing that the Institute's reach and cunning extended far beyond the immediate conflict, shaping not only Shaun's identity, but the fates of countless Commonwealth inhabitants through synth deployment, covert kidnappings, and calculated manipulation. Beyond the factual revelations, the Memory Den experience left the sole survivor grappling with questions of memory, perception, and reality, as the technology allowed him to feel Kellogg's fear, guilt, and indoctrination firsthand, producing an intimate understanding of a man who had been both villain and pawn in a larger system. And this psychological insight proved invaluable in planning the sole survivor's next moves, informing strategic decisions on whom to trust, how to navigate the fractured factions, and the delicate negotiation between vengeance, justice, and survival. Ultimately, The den provided not just information but perspective, forcing the sole survivor to reconcile his grief for the family he had lost with the responsibilities imposed by a son now grown into power. And it became clear that reclaiming Shaun's future, confronting the Institute's ambitions, and choosing the path the Commonwealth would follow, could no longer be considered in isolation, for the actions he took in the wake of these revelations would ripple outward, affecting human, synth, and mutant lives across Boston, and framing the sole survivor not merely as a parent or survivor, but as a decisive agent in a conflict that was as moral and philosophical as it was physical, a conflict in which the lines between right and wrong, human and synthetic, past and present, blurred under the weight of memory, consequence, and the inescapable legacy of the Great War. The sole survivor's relentless pursuit of Shaun eventually culminated in a journey deep into the hidden corridors of the Institute itself, a sprawling subterranean complex of pre-war technology, advanced robotics, and synthetic life where every hallway, laboratory, and control center reflected centuries of human ambition, preserved and refined beyond the comprehension of surface dwellers. And as he descended further into the heart of this shadowy organization, he was confronted not only with the material mastery of science, vertibird docks, automated defense grids, fusion-powered generators, and cutting-edge biotechnological facilities, but also with the ideological framework that shaped every decision, every experiment, and every synthetic deployment, all designed to bring Father's vision for humanity into reality, while ensuring absolute loyalty to the Institute's mission. The reunion with Shaun, now fully matured into Father, was as emotionally seismic as it was politically and ethically complex, for the sole survivor faced the impossible task of reconciling the intimate, paternal bond that had been violently severed decades earlier with the cold, pragmatic persona of the man who had grown under the Institute's indoctrination and oversight, a figure whose worldview prioritized technological stewardship and human survival as defined by his organization rather than the instinctive, emotional morality that guided the sole survivor. And in this encounter, the depth of the Institute's influence became undeniable, as every corridor walked, every terminal accessed, and every conversation with scientists and operatives revealed a society meticulously engineered to perpetuate its power, shield its methods from the outside world, and mold its human and synthetic components into instruments of a predetermined future. Within the Institute, the sole survivor witnessed firsthand the scope of synth integration into Commonwealth life, observing replicants functioning undetected among settlers, performing critical roles in surveillance, construction, and law enforcement, while the ethical implications of these practices became increasingly clear. These sentient beings, biologically indistinguishable from humans, were denied agency, autonomy, and moral consideration, yet their existence was necessary for the Institute to maintain dominance, manipulate settlements, and secure the technological infrastructure that ensured the organization's survival against external threats, including the Minutemen, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Railroad. As the sole survivor interacted with the Institute's leaders and navigated the complex hierarchy, he was faced with difficult decisions regarding loyalty, strategy, and morality, balancing the immediate necessity of protecting Shaun with the broader consequences of either confronting or aligning with the organization, while also evaluating how the Institute's technological superiority and social engineering could be leveraged, neutralized, or repurposed to influence the future of the Commonwealth. And each step revealed the fragility of power structures built on secrecy, coercion, and ideological purity, as well as the human cost of progress pursued without empathy. Ultimately, The sole survivor's confrontation with Father was not merely a clash of wills, but a profound negotiation between competing visions of civilization, between parental love and institutional duty, between the freedom of individuals and the deterministic control of a technologically omnipotent society. And it became clear that the outcomes of this encounter, whether through dialogue, confrontation, or subtle subversion, would reverberate far beyond the sterile corridors of the Institute, determining the alignment of the Commonwealth's factions, the fate of synths throughout Boston, and the historical legacy of the sole survivor himself, whose choices at this juncture would define not only the reunion with his son, but also the philosophical, ethical, and material trajectory of an entire post-apocalyptic society struggling to reconcile survival, morality, and the promise of rebuilding a fractured world from the ruins of the Great War. With the knowledge gained from the Institute and the alliances formed across the Commonwealth, the sole survivor found himself at the epicenter of a looming conflict that would determine the fate of every settlement, synth, and faction, as tensions between the Minutemen, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad, and the Institute reached a breaking point, and each group's ideological and strategic ambitions threatened to plunge the region into full-scale war, a war shaped as much by philosophical divides and competing visions of society as by firepower and numbers. And the sole survivor, uniquely positioned with personal knowledge of Shaun, mastery of pre-war and post-war technology, and a reputation forged through survival, leadership, and moral choices, became the critical pivot upon which the conflict turned. The initial skirmishes were localized but intense, from raider ambushes on Minutemen supply lines to Brotherhood patrols asserting control over strategic bridges, airfields, and industrial centers, and each engagement highlighted the complexities of command in a landscape where every civilian, building, and pre-war structure could influence the balance of power, as the sole survivor coordinated reinforcements, salvaged weapons, and advised settlement leaders while simultaneously contending with the covert operations of the Railroad, whose rescue missions and intelligence gathering both undermined the Institute's authority and risked provoking unpredictable retaliation. Environmental hazards compounded the difficulty of military operations, with radiation storms, irradiated rivers, super mutant patrols, and roaming deathclaws forcing all factions to adapt strategies constantly, to fortify positions, and to anticipate threats that were as often natural as they were human, while the sole survivor leveraged his unique perspective, having interacted with all major factions, to negotiate temporary truces, gather critical intelligence, and exploit weaknesses, understanding that the war was as much about perception, morale, and alliances as it was about sheer firepower. The arrival of the Brotherhood's Pride win in Boston introduced a decisive shift, as its vertibirds, heavy infantry, and energy weapons allowed Elder Maxson to project authority rapidly across contested regions, but simultaneously fueled resentment among settlers and Minutemen who feared subjugation, while the Institute's synth deployments, cloaked infiltrations, and kidnapping operations demonstrated their willingness to manipulate, intimidate, and eliminate opposition quietly, creating an atmosphere where trust was scarce, and the sole survivor's judgment became indispensable in determining when to engage, negotiate, or withdraw, and which factions would benefit or suffer as a result. Throughout this escalating conflict, the sole survivor's role became both operational and symbolic, embodying the possibility of unity, the weight of vengeance, and the moral authority of someone who had endured the greatest personal loss, yet remained committed to shaping a just outcome. And as settlements prepared for sieges, weapons caches were mobilized, and strategic strongpoints like the castle, Fort Independence, and the mass fusion building became battlegrounds. The sole survivor orchestrated campaigns, coordinated Minutemen forces, leveraged railroad intelligence, and occasionally confronted Brotherhood and Institute officers directly, using both diplomacy and force, understanding that the outcome of these clashes would not only determine control of the Commonwealth's territory and resources, but also the ethical precedent for how humans, synths, and mutant populations would coexist in the new era. And as the first volleys of the battle echoed across ruined streets, irradiated fields, and fortified compounds, it became clear that the struggle was not simply a fight for land or supremacy, but a confrontation between competing visions of civilization itself, with the sole survivor at the fulcrum, balancing the survival of loved ones, the moral imperatives of freedom and justice, and the broader consequences of decisions that would echo for generations in a society rising from the ashes of nuclear annihilation. As the sole survivor reached the decisive stage of the Commonwealth struggle, the culmination of alliances, rivalries, and personal choices crystallized into 4 possible futures, each representing not only the control of Boston and its surrounding settlements, but also the moral, social, and technological trajectory of post-war society. And in every scenario, the sole survivor's decisions shaped not only the fate of Shaun and the Institute, but also the lives of countless settlers, synths, and warriors across the region, with each path carrying consequences that reflected both the power and the responsibility of leadership. In the Minutemen victory, the sole survivor's careful restoration of the militia, the recruitment of citizens, and the establishment of fortified settlements allowed a decentralized yet resilient network to rise, emphasizing democratic governance, local autonomy, and mutual protection, which resulted in a commonwealth where survivors could rebuild with relative freedom, settlements flourished under communal oversight, and synths were allowed limited freedom if tolerated by the local communities, while the Institute was neutralized, forced into exile, or dismantled, and the sole survivor became a unifying figure, a symbol of hope, and a custodian of both ethical integrity and practical security, ensuring that technological power did not translate into authoritarian control. In the Brotherhood victory, Elder Maxon's militarized vision prevailed, with the sole survivor either collaborating to consolidate control or opposing but ultimately witnessing the ascendancy of an organized, hierarchical force that prioritized strict stewardship over technology, enforcement of order, and the suppression of synths, resulting in a commonwealth where technological knowledge was safeguarded under strict military protocols, settlements adhered to martial law or were subjugated, and the balance of power skewed toward disciplined, centralized authority, with the sole survivor navigating the tension between moral responsibility and compliance, with a rigid system that valued security and order above individual freedoms. In the railroad victory, the liberation of synths became the defining principle, as the sole survivor's cooperation facilitated the escape and protection of countless synthetic beings, creating a commonwealth where human-synth relations were fundamentally altered. Social justice for artificial life was institutionalized in key sectors, and the Institute's influence waned as its kidnapped children, experimental programs, and covert operations were exposed and curtailed. But this freedom came at a cost, as both Minutemen and Brotherhood forces were weakened or disbanded. The stability of human settlements depended heavily on railroad-provided oversight, and the sole survivor's role evolved into that of a moral architect, mediating between emergent social groups, guiding ethical governance, and ensuring that the rights of liberated synths did not provoke new cycles of violence or exploitation. Finally, in the Institute victory, Father's vision was fully realized, with the sole survivor either complicit or overruled in his attempts to influence the organization, resulting in a Boston dominated by technological meritocracy, where synths occupied central positions in society. The Institute's authority was absolute, and pre-war knowledge and science were deployed to enforce a future determined by intellect and controlled evolution, rather than democratic participation, producing efficiency, order, and scientific advancement at the cost of personal freedoms, local autonomy, and the decentralized moral agency that the sole survivor had fought to preserve, forcing him to confront the ethical ramifications of a civilization where survival and progress were prioritized over individual liberty. Across all four possibilities, the sole survivor's decisions, how to approach each faction, which battles to fight, which alliances to honor, and how to confront Shaun, Father, shaped not only immediate outcomes, but also the long-term historical legacy of Boston, embedding the consequences of personal loss, moral conviction, strategic insight, and leadership into the very fabric of a Commonwealth struggling to emerge from the ashes of nuclear devastation. And in reflecting on these divergent futures, it becomes evident that the post-war world is not solely defined by survival, but by the vision, courage, and choices of a single individual capable of guiding society through chaos toward either liberation, domination, balance, or authoritarian control, with the sole survivor at the center of history, determining the ultimate fate of human and synthetic life alike. With the decisive conflicts resolved and the future of Boston crystallized through the sole survivor's choices, the long-term legacy of his actions began to unfold across the Commonwealth, revealing the profound consequences of survival, leadership, and moral judgment in a world reshaped by nuclear annihilation, technological advancement, and centuries of human struggle. And as the dust settled, the sole survivor's role transcended that of a mere survivor to become a central figure in the historical, political, and cultural narrative of post-war society, whose influence would persist across generations, shaping not only the distribution of power, but also the ethical framework and societal norms that emerged from chaos. Settlements rebuilt under his guidance, whether through the democratic, decentralized Minutemen, the militarized order of the Brotherhood of Steel, the liberated networks of the railroad, or the technologically centralized institute, each bore the imprint of his decisions, reflecting his ability to balance pragmatism, empathy, and strategic foresight in environments where resources were scarce, threats were constant, and the boundaries between life, survival, and morality were often indistinguishable. While his personal journey, from Vault 111 to the surface, through loss, reunion, and confrontation with Shaun, Father, served as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, demonstrating the power and cost of agency in a fractured world. Beyond institutional influence, the sole survivor's legacy was visible in the social, technological, and environmental transformations of the Commonwealth, from fortified settlements connected by trade and mutual defense, to the integration or liberation of synth populations, to the preservation or destruction of pre-war knowledge, and even to the subtle reshaping of human-animal ecosystems in response to radiation and human activity, illustrating how a single individual's decisions could ripple through complex adaptive systems over decades, influencing both immediate survival and long-term sustainability. The sole survivor's interactions with factions, allies, and enemies left enduring ethical precedents. Questions of justice, freedom, loyalty, and technological stewardship were codified not merely in laws or decrees, but in the lived experiences of those communities that survived under his guidance, with each settlement, synth, and human actor carrying the consequences of his moral calculus into the next generation, whether through the training of new leaders, the construction of fortified defenses, the careful management of scarce resources, or the implementation of ethical practices in warfare and diplomacy. Culturally, the figure of the sole survivor became emblematic of resilience and responsibility, a person who, despite the overwhelming devastation of the Great War, the loss of his spouse, the abduction of his child, and the moral ambiguities posed by factions like the Institute and the Railroad, managed to impose a vision upon a fractured society that combined survival, ethical reflection, and strategic governance, and this cultural influence extended into folklore, oral histories, and community practices, where stories of his exploits, judgments, and interventions served to inspire caution, courage, and ethical reasoning among the inhabitants of the Commonwealth. Technologically, the sole survivor's legacy included the repurposing, preservation, or neutralization of advanced pre-war and Institute-era systems, ensuring that humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction remained in balance, and that knowledge, whether applied to energy weapons, robotics, cryogenics, or synthetic intelligence, was mediated by human ethical oversight, preventing unchecked domination while providing the tools necessary for continued reconstruction and innovation. And finally, on a deeply personal level, the sole survivor's enduring impact was defined by the reconciliation with Shaun, the careful stewardship of those who looked to him for guidance, and the symbolic testament that even in the aftermath of total societal collapse, individual agency, moral courage, and persistent action could reshape history, influence the destiny of entire populations, and ensure that the Commonwealth, while forever scarred by nuclear fire, would continue to grow, adapt, and survive under the indelible mark of a single survivor whose story became inseparable from the rebirth, governance, and enduring spirit of post-war Boston, leaving a legacy that intertwined familial, ethical, strategic, and societal threads into a coherent narrative of human perseverance, leadership, and the profound responsibility carried by those who endure, when history itself seems determined to erase them.